Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Drug Cultures. I'm Sky Hawthorne. This is my show. All opinions expressed here are my own, as is all music. And as always, nothing I say on the podcast should be taken as medical advice. I'm not a physician. I do not and will not recommend that anybody take any drug for any reason. All content produced here is for the purposes of education, entertainment, and occasionally harm reduction. Anyways, on today's episode of Drug Cultures, I have an amazing interview lined up for you all. His name is Oshin Diaz, and he runs a brick-and-mortar kratom dispensary called Jaya Kratom, or Jaya Kratom, he uses the other pronunciation. But he runs this kratom dispensary here in my home city of Portland, Oregon, in my neighborhood, actually. And this interview was the culmination of one of those serendipitous little moments that I look back on and think, what a splendid interaction. You know, I was in my neighborhood looking for parking at the local grocery store and ended up seeing this little blue building just a couple blocks away. And it certainly wasn't my first time seeing a store that sells kratom. In states where the plant or its alkaloids are legal, you can find capsules or extract bottles sold in gas stations and smoke shops, you name it. But I'd never seen such a whimsical storefront dedicated entirely to kratom. So I poked my head in, and sure enough, there was the man I'll be interviewing today, Oshin Diaz. He and his partner Emmy started this kratom dispensary together, and within just a few minutes of talking to them, I realized that they knew significantly more about this plant and its history than I did. And I've done multiple episodes and articles about kratom. I'm usually the one telling people about kratom. And there I am in this store just getting my mind blown by the knowledge that these people have. So this is an episode about Jaya Kratom, sure, but more than that, I quickly realized it's the perfect drug culture's story because it's about a place, not a drug. This is a story about how kratom is rapidly transforming Borneo's economy. Traditionally, for decades and even centuries, Borneo has had an export-oriented economy, and this is still the case today. It's part of what made the island so valuable to both the Dutch and the British. Under British and Dutch colonial rule, the most valuable export commodity was oil. And this is especially true for the British regions in the north, what's now Malaysia and in particular Brunei. In fact, these oil deposits were part of how Brunei was able to maintain its sovereignty, with the rest of the north having to sort of become Malaysia to stay economically viable. Now, in the middle of the 20th century, the primary export of the island shifted from oil to something that is somehow even worse for the environment, and that's logging. Starting in the 1950s, but really picking up in the 70s and 80s, you started to see large-scale deforestation in both the Indonesian and the Malaysian sides of Borneo. And the scale of devastation inflicted by the timber industry on this island is hard to overstate. Half of the global tropical timber acquired annually comes from Borneo, to this day. Borneo is a huge island, mind you. Because it's on the equator, it doesn't look all that big in maps, but it's bigger than Texas, third largest island in the world behind only Greenland and New Guinea. In 1970, 75% of Borneo was natural forest, and much of that was old growth, old trees, rich peatland ecosystems. By 2010, 30% of this natural forest had been clear-cut. These forests are worth preserving for their own sake, of course. This is tremendous biodiversity we're talking about, but they're also a very important carbon sink. Preserving the rainforests of Borneo is just as important as preserving the Amazon or the boreal forests of Canada if we want a snowball's chance in hell of stopping climate change. Anyways, for decades, logging was by far the biggest industry in Borneo, but logging companies often paid the workers hardly enough to live on, so rural smallholders would supplement their income by growing rubber, which had been introduced by the British in the late 19th century. So rubber was this economic buffer for a lot of smallholders, and that's actually the role that kratom is now starting to play for a lot of these same farmers, which I promise we'll get to. This is still an episode of Drug Cultures, after all. But there's one more industry to talk about first, and that's the palm oil industry. Now, this industry and the logging industry have sort of a parasitic symbiosis in Borneo, because there is an ethical way to do logging. If you don't cut all the trees in a forest, you just do like selective cuttings, the timber industry can continue to exist without decimating old-growth forests and destroying ancient ecosystems. But palm trees can't be grown in the middle of an old-growth forest. So there's this perverse incentive for loggers to clear-cut these rainforests so that palm oil growers can plant their trees. These palm trees do absolutely nothing to sequester carbon, and in fact often require the draining of peatland swamps, which amounts to the destruction of very important carbon sinks. So here's where kratom comes in. In Malaysia, kratom is illegal, so you won't find a whole lot of people in Malaysian Borneo willing to go on the record about growing it, though it absolutely does happen. But in Indonesia, kratom has been an important part of the economy for years and has existed in a sort of legal gray area. The Indonesian Trade Ministry recognized that there was a rapidly growing export market for kratom around the world. This is particularly true in the United States, where as many as 15 million Americans are estimated to use the plant for pain relief, addiction recovery, or just because they like the way it feels. The Indonesian Narcotics Agency disagreed with the Trade Ministry and was lobbying for kratom's prohibition on the grounds that it could be addictive and was recognized as a drug of abuse by some other countries. But in 2024, Indonesia created a formal legal framework for the production and export of kratom, including setting laws that kratom had to be processed and ground in Indonesia. Most people who take kratom, at least those who use its leaf form and not some sort of extract or concentrate, do it in the form of powder. It's not super common here in the United States that people take kratom the way it's traditionally used in Indonesia or in Thailand, which is as a loose leaf tea. So because Westerners like their kratom as a powder, Indonesia formalized the requirement that the creation of that powder has to be done in Indonesia, which basically nationalizes as much of the industry as possible. So now kratom is this tree that already grows natively in Borneo, is easier than rubber for smallholder farmers to grow on their own, and is officially sanctioned by the Indonesian government. But perhaps most importantly, considering everything we talked about earlier, it's actually great for the environment. Because unlike palm trees, kratom trees grow well in the sort of soggy, peatland, riparian ecosystems that act as such an important carbon sink and as real hotspots of biodiversity. Kratom can also be grown alongside other cash crops like rice. So really, this is a very liberating industry for a lot of people in rural Borneo, whose only choices in the past might have been go move to a city hours away to find work, or work in the logging industry, or work in an illegal gold mine. It's a double win. Good for the environment and good for the financial stability of the rural poor. But, of course, this fledgling industry depends greatly on the continued legality of kratom in its destination markets, which is very much not a sure thing. As we speak, states across the country are attempting to ban kratom after several years of negative publicity, mostly about kratom-derived extract products, including a huge moral panic about the 7-OH industry in particular, which I had the privilege of writing about for High Times a few months ago. Kansas and Kentucky are both in the process of banning kratom. Connecticut just did it a couple months ago, Louisiana banned it last year, and Gavin Newsom's Department of Public Health is currently waging a crusade against kratom products in California. So the future of all of this is very much uncertain, but here's what is certain. You're going to love this interview with Oshin Diaz of Jaya Kratom, coming right up after the break. So I mean, I guess I want to just get things started by talking about how cool your store is. This is the first interview I'm doing for this show that was just based off of me seeing a storefront, walking in, and thinking like, "Wow, this business is cool." So to to paint people a picture of what they do, this is a company called Jaya Kratom, or I don't know if you like to call it Kratom. I know people have disagreements over the pronunciation. But the first thing I noticed walking in was that you have a big tree in the center of the store.
Yes, so I do believe I was there when you came in for the first time, and we had our door open. It was a nice day, and we have a probably 10-foot kratom tree growing in the center of the store, and we've actually topped it multiple times because it's been hitting the ceiling and hitting the grow lights. But it's a fantastic educational piece, and one of my favorite things is when people pass by our storefront here in Portland and you get plant people and they don't recognize what we're growing there, and actually having them come in and trying to identify what it is, and then getting to tell them about how we germinated these seeds that we got from Southeast Asia and germinated them into a humidity chamber, and how these trees have spent their entire 4 or 5 years of life all in our shop. And it's a great educational tool because a lot of people that we meet have been consuming kratom for decades and have actually never seen the plant in its real form. So it's total pleasure.
So you, just to clarify, you got like seeds from Borneo. This was not like saplings or anything. This was germinated directly from seed, and you brought them back here to Portland, Oregon, and have grown them from seed to what they are now in your shop.
Precisely, yeah. So it was a really, really fun adventure growing these seeds, actually, because it was our first, foray into growing indoor kratom, and there's, basically no resources on that. So yeah, we brought the seeds back from the Borneo rainforest, and then we managed to germinate them in humidity trays, and they actually spent the first almost year of their life in humidity chambers of varying sizes, because out in the Borneo rainforest, Southeast Asia, we're looking really high humidity levels, really hot, obviously. So that is where we recreated that environment for them, and did a really interesting process of slowly acclimatizing them to being used to normal indoor humidity levels, where we had them in these larger humidity tents around the 8 months of age. We started inching the zipper open inch by inch over the course of a number of months, and they gradually acclimatized to normal indoor 68 to 70 degree indoor temperatures. And it was fascinating because we tried removing the tent immediately on some of them, or undoing the zipper 6 inches or 12 inches and seeing what would happen, and they would totally freak out, and the leaves would essentially look like they're kind of melting. They would curl in on themselves, totally totally unhappy with that process, until we just figured out, okay, it has to be super gradual, and then they get used to it.
That's really interesting, and that's such a testament to this plant's adaptability. Because I always assumed you couldn't have a kratom tree in even indoors in the Portland, Oregon climate, right? I associate it with growing in Southeast Asia, and then I hear every now and then about people in Florida growing kratom trees.
Mhm.
I never expected to see one of these in Portland.
Yeah, so if you really take your time and you know what you're doing and you acclimatize it, you can make it happen. And yeah, in one of the kind of darker, colder corners of the U.S., we have probably now we've actually pared them down because our back room was just full of kratom trees that were growing really rapidly. So I think we have probably about a dozen of them that we've kept, and usually we have the two biggest, healthiest ones in the front of the shop. Sometimes we rotate them. Um, One of the more interesting facts we've learned about growing kratom in a colder climate is that they're not actually tropical evergreen trees. You read any sort of historical text or Wikipedia page about kratom, and it's a evergreen, tropical evergreen tree. When you put them in a colder climate, they do in fact tend to drop their leaves if they get any sort of exposure below 68, 65 degrees, which will happen. We've had the electricity go out on us on winter, and they have completely lost all their leaves, and then they grow back in the spring. So to a certain extent, they are deciduous, where if they get exposed to a cold shock, they'll just completely drop their leaves and yellow and everything.
It's like when you domesticate a fox or a coyote and they start to act like dogs. It's like that programming is still in there somewhere. It's just
Yes.
not normally expressed. Um,
Absolutely. And then we were really, really excited that they actually flowered for us for the first time last year. So we had beautiful kratom flowers, and we weren't sure if that was ever going to happen because, they have to be quite, you know, quite happy to go into the flowering stage, and they did. And they did not produce viable seeds, but we're hoping that in the next year they're going to flower for us again, and that we might be able to get, a second generation of this indoor kratom grown from those seeds and see, what kind of genetic traits have been passed down, and if it's even hardier with the cold and all of that. But yeah, now they're doing absolutely wonderfully, and we often, pick back some of the unhealthy leaves after the winter, and then they come back in force in the spring. So now's a great time. If you are in the Portland area, come into the shop and see them as they're adapting and regrowing in the spring.
I will sign on to that. Do you sell leaves from the trees that you have? I know that chewing the leaves is one of the traditional ways in which the plant is consumed. Do you sell the leaves, or is it just like an expositional, here's what we grow here tree?
Yeah, so we really just use them as an educational piece, just to show people, hey, this is the plant, this is what it looks like, and to, discuss the mechanisms that go into drying the leaves and the parts of the plant that are used and everything. Technically, everything we sell has to be lab tested because we are in a Kratom consumer protection state, which is phenomenal. But according to the Oregon Department of Agriculture licensing that we have, everything should be lab tested. So in theory, we would have to pick and then lab test the fresh leaves in order to be able to sell them here in Oregon. So we don't, but uh, occasionally, if you're super nice, maybe we'll give you one to take home.
Well, I wouldn't want to do anything that would make you lose your license. But how did you realize that you wanted to make a business out of this? Because I feel like lots of people try kratom and they're like, "Oh, this is great," but it takes a different mind to be like, "I wanna make a living out of this."
That's a great question, Sky. Actually, it wasn't our idea. It was the Kratom farmers we met out in Borneo's idea originally, because my partner and I, Emmy, we were living in Indonesia for a couple of years, and I'd known about Kratom. I want to say all the way back, like 2009 or 2010. Had discovered it quite a long time ago. Always really liked the plant. Found it to be super useful in a number of aspects of life. And then, yeah, fast forward to 2018, 2019, we were living out in Indonesia, and we're just completely blown away by the quality of the kratom that we were actually finding in Indonesia, and kind of re-fell in love with the plant out there. Um, it was, green instead of brown. It had a great flavor instead of being bitter. The effects were phenomenal. We were able to take really, really small doses of it and have a phenomenal effect. So that kind of got the wheels turning in our mind of, okay, what's influencing the quality of kratom? How does this grow? How's this grown? What does the behind the scenes of the kratom industry look like? We were just kind of flooded with different questions, and we were living in Bali in Indonesia at the time, which is relatively close to Borneo. There's actually no kratom grown in Bali whatsoever, despite Bali kratom being a common strain name for kratom. You're not going to find any kratom growing in Bali, but we were close enough to Borneo that we said, hey, this is a viable idea. Let's see if we can get some research funding. Let's see if we can get out there. And I studied history. My partner, she focused more on photography. So we said, hey, let's make a little team and let's go out there and do a kratom research trip, because we were both passionate about ethnobotanicals. Had both always wanted to get out to the Borneo rainforest, because it's 140 million year old rainforest, second oldest in the world. Just seemed like a incredible place. So this was a great excuse to go out there and roam around Borneo and to learn about the kratom industry. And yeah, so long story short, it was a purely academic, personal interest project. And then we were out there spending weeks with these kratom farmers, and they were all kind of very surprised that we'd come out there to visit them, and they were also very surprised that we didn't work in the kratom industry, because at that time in 2019, there'd only been like one or two, I think, Westerners, Kratom people from the US that had come out and, done like one handshake, take a photo, stay 24 hours and left. Um, and that's still honestly the case where there's very few people that have gone and spent extensive time, or if anything, it's like, a day or a weekend. But yeah, so we spent a bunch of time with the Kratom farmers, and it was their idea. They said, what are you guys doing? Why do you not sell kratom? Why do you not have a kratom business in the U.S.? And they kind of convinced us of it, and we became really good friends with these kratom growers, and they actually sent us for free our first tiny shipments way, way, way back in the day. So
That's really cool. So, talk a little bit more about you were living in Bali with your partner, and
mhm.
obviously Bali has a lot of infrastructure for Western tourists. It has a lot of probably people who speak English. Certainly, a lot of what we would consider modernized infrastructure. And then you hop out to Borneo, and obviously Borneo has cities as well. But I imagine that's not that close to where the kratom is grown. Talk a little bit about that experience of getting to know Borneo better. And was there culture shock? Was there a language barrier? What was your experience like crossing that bridge?
Yeah, that's a great question. Borneo is a really fascinating place. It's like the third biggest island in the world geographically. It's absolutely enormous. Just to give some context, Borneo, including the Malaysian side and the Indonesian side and the Sultanate of Brunei, it's bigger than Texas. It's like three times the size of the UK. So first of all, just absolutely enormous landmass. Um, and yeah, so we got out there, and you do have some decent sized cities in Borneo, but they are predominantly all along the coastline. So the real area of Kratom country, as they like to call it, is actually really in the center of Borneo, which is about a 12 to 15-hour drive from the coastal cities. So you have most of the Kratom industry is centered around Pontianak in West Borneo, and that's where all of the major exporters and the people that you might be talking to if you are importing or working with kratom are living in the city. And then you go about 12 hours inland into really super remote areas, and that is where you find kratom growing both wildly and then also being cultivated. And yeah, it's really two huge different worlds, and we actually found it to be fascinating that a lot of the first people we were meeting in Pontianak that were selling kratom and exporting kratom, working with kratom, had never been to the farms themselves. So they were as far removed from the reality of kratom cultivation as you or I sitting on the West Coast practically.
What was there? Was it just that it's inconvenient for them to go in, or they didn't have a monetary incentive, or do you speak any of the? I don't know what is spoken in Borneo. Is it Indonesian? Is it indigenous languages? Did you find that
Yes,
was an issue?
yes, definitely. So for the first research trip we took out there in 2019, we had a translator that spoke English and Indonesian, and then he was also versed in some of the local dialects. So there are also traditional languages and just also just slightly different dialects of Indonesian going on. But everybody will be able to speak a certain level of Indonesian out there. And so yeah, so for that first trip, we went with a translator, which was totally, totally 100% necessary in these areas. There's not really guest houses or hotels. You're sleeping with extended family on the floor, or different kratom farmers would invite us in. Super super remote, sleeping on the kratom farmers floor, you know system. And so definitely after that trip, we realized that we needed to learn Indonesian ourselves just to have more direct line of communication, because there's always that element of detail that's lost with a translator. And so yeah, so when we went back on our second and our most recent research trip in 2014, excuse me, 2024, we spent about a month out there again, and this time we had been studying Indonesian and were able to communicate a lot better ourselves, which was certainly quite useful. But yeah, really, really remote land, really, really interesting. And one of the most fascinating things you see is the visual impact of kratom cultivation out in these areas, because As you start to drive out away from the coast into the center of Borneo, you'll see, hours and hours and hours, maybe 5, 6 hours driving in the car of palm oil plantation, endless. And then areas of deforestation and areas that have been logged and then planted with palm oil, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, you get out to areas that have, wild kratom growing, or areas of land that have been, rehabilitated where they used to grow rubber as well, and then they've actually removed the rubber trees and then planted them with kratom, which from an ecological perspective is really cool because kratom actually is, from the area and what was originally there before the rubber. So
Yeah, talk a little more about that, because my understanding is that both the rubber industry and the palm oil industry are very environmentally disruptive, to put it mildly.
hmm
And whereas my understanding is kratom, grows naturally in these sort of riparian wetland ecosystems, and it can be multi-crop. It can be planted alongside both other cash crops and other crops that can be put there for ecosystem health. And also, my understanding is that these kratom forests can even be a big carbon sink. So,
hmm
is that something you noticed, that there was an environmental component to the work that's being done out there, and just like the changing economy of Borneo?
Yes, absolutely. So everybody we spoke with was just absolutely glowing with praise for the kratom industry because it has been a huge, ecological and economic boon for people there, where folks out in these really remote areas have been able to make a living for themselves without destroying their environment. Folks there, they know that logging the rainforest is bad. They understand that the palm oil plantations are requiring tons of pesticides and fertilizers and are causing runoff issues. And you talk to people that have lived with palm oil plantations in their community, and they see the devastating impact that it has on the rivers and on the health of the surrounding area. So basically moving to kratom as the primary crop there, primary source of income, has allowed people to earn on average. You often hear like 4 or 5 times more, so they're earning more and are able to also, yeah, participate in an industry that doesn't destroy the environment, which is really cool. There's also a number of other benefits whereas yes, you mentioned, like rubber tends to be very seasonal. There's times of the year when you can't harvest. Kratom you can harvest throughout the whole year more effectively like that. Um, so yeah, so for a number of reasons, we found that everybody there was super super happy to have Kratom becoming more popular and to being able to switch their income away from yeah, logging palm oil, rubber, and to Kratom, which just grows in many cases natively along the riverbanks near the village. So even if you haven't planted it yourself, you could potentially go out and collect leaves and make a bit of income.
That's really, really cool. That's Do you find that there's a lot of increased economic independence for people who make the switch from one other industry to kratom, or for maybe people who are previously economically disenfranchised in one way or the other? Like, do you feel there's much of a barrier to entry for getting into the kratom industry for these people, or whether it's pretty easy to start if you own a small plot of land to grow kratom and make some money doing it?
Yeah, very easy to start. So there's the possibility of finding, wild kratom trees that might grow near your village for one. There's also, yes, getting involved with people that already have existing kratom growing on their land, so very easy to find employment. The economic situation has gotten, rapidly better in that Kapuas Hulu Regency in that area, really anywhere they're going kratom. And then it's also enabled people to stay in their traditional villages and in their communities. Because one of the biggest things we heard was that, okay, before Kratom, I could make money, but it would require me going, to the next major city, maybe 8 hours or 4 hours away, leaving my family and going to work for 6 months and then coming back for a couple of weeks and going to work for 6 months and coming back for a couple of weeks. So actually working with a plant that grows in the community in these, ultra remote communities way out in the middle of the Borneo rainforest has allowed people to actually, stay on their traditional land and make a good living. So people were super, super happy about that and are talking about, that yes, they're able to then, you know, send their children to school if they want to and, just in generally improve their economic situation. Yeah.
Well, that's so great. And I mean, obviously, with any of these sort of examples of a developing country reorienting or developing their economy to be focused on a specific export, you get health issues, labor issues, and that's the case whether it's rubber or palm oil or kratom. I'm sure you're going to see that regardless. Can you talk a little bit about what you've noticed or what you've tried to do differently at Jaya in terms of those issues or in terms of just the general kratom supply chain from other big kratom, for lack of a better word?
Yeah, totally. So I often try and kind of paint a picture with folks that come into our store about what we're doing differently, where it's small batch, it's single origin, and it's also wild harvested. Where the way the kratom industry works is that typically, there might be a 20 or 40 ton container shipment that'll come in for, some of these really large companies. And to fulfill an order of 20 or 40 tons like that is going to require huge, kratom plantations, or it's going to require hundreds of different kratom, small hold agricultures, right, to pool their crop to fulfill a 20-ton container shipment. And then the leaves are all getting mixed together. So you might have, let's say 100 out of those 500 farmers, right, that are harvesting the leaves at peak maturity, that are, planting the trees in a good area where they have enough water and they have good fertilization from the river overflowing, et cetera, and are in these ideal conditions. But then the other, 80% of that container might have been, you know, harvested prematurely, trees are not planted in the right area, quality is not correct, and then it's all getting mixed together, which can really bring down the overall quality. Um, and then you also farther have the issue that this, 20, 40 ton container then takes forever to kind of cycle through the system in the US and with the warehousing system, et cetera, et cetera. So what the end consumer might be getting is a very subpar kratom that then's been sitting on shelves for years, and in the end you get that classic kind of dry brown looking kratom instead of a bright vivid green. So what we're doing is working with really small batches. So if we're working with a farmer or now all wild harvest, we're only going to order the amount that we know that person can produce, right? Not going to ask, since we've been there and spent time with them, we know, hey, we can ask this particular harvester for this amount, and they're going to be able to produce that without cutting corners, without mixing, crops from other sources that we don't know anything about. And then one of the other issues that we've seen kind of occurring is increased pesticide use. That's something that we're really concerned about. So that's where we only work with cultivators with wild harvest sources that are pesticide free, and that are directly with communities. A lot of times there can be multiple people within the supply chain, so you're very, very far removed from the person that actually picked that leaf and actually dried that leaf. Whereas we work directly with small families that live out and own the land that the wild tom lives on.
Yeah, that's very, very cool. And what about issues related to like heavy metals? I know that's something a lot of people are concerned about.
Yeah.
How do you make sure that isn't happening? And then just, I guess you talked about pesticides already, but
Yeah, I mean, so the first thing is just simply just lab testing, just third-party lab testing with an ISO accredited lab, and lab testing for heavy metals, microbials, pesticides, all of that. So that's going to be, the most important thing. I really always encourage people not to consume lab tested kratom, to not consume unlab tested kratom, because there can really be a variety of issues. Heavy metals is an interesting one. So there's a couple of different theories of how these elevated heavy metal levels have occurred historically. One thing that we saw a lot of, especially back in 2019, was milling equipment that was just not up to spec, where people were maybe using like, coffee. We saw some like coffee milling equipment from like 1950s, like India and China, some super super antiquated milling machine with like, chipping paint. So there's like maybe paint chipping off these old milling machines. They're not using the, stainless steel. That could introduce heavy metals into the kratom. So obviously having, stainless steel proper milling machine is super important. Um, but then the other thing is that, you do always have these trace amounts of heavy metals bioaccumulating into the plants, right? That's something that we see with, with matcha, with tea of all kind, with any sort of, leafy plant. You're going to bioaccumulate these tiny amounts of heavy metals, which is a totally natural and normal thing. Emphasis on trace, right? So zero point whatever part per million is always going to be there in these, safe minute amounts. Um, However, one of the other kind of environmental issues out in this part of the world is illegal gold mining. And kratom is a tree that grows right on the riverbanks. It is a water-loving plant. It grows along the river. That's its natural habitat. And then that is also, unfortunately, the area that's affected by some of these illegal gold mines, where people are, washing the gold with mercury. Mercury gets into the river. They stir up heavy metals, mining the earth, and then that can be bioaccumulated by the kratom plant. So, of course, you can test when you receive the goods to make sure that it doesn't have heavy metals, but also knowing the land, firsthand where you're sourcing it and making sure that there's not, um, yeah,
Yeah,
mining
having
happening.
been there and been like, okay, so this smallholder farm is a few miles away from an illegal gold mine,
Yeah,
but you're never gonna find that out if you don't go there yourself, or if someone you know doesn't go there yourself.
yeah. Otherwise, you might receive something, hopefully lab test it, and have like crazy high levels of heavy metals. Yeah, yeah.
Well, on the subject of legality, I had a couple questions related to that. So I found contradictory things when I was looking into the legal status of kratom in Indonesia. Like I think there was a law that sort of formalized its legality a few years ago, but before then you had like their narcotics control board saying no, 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 this is illegal, whereas you had their financial department saying we need this for our internal revenue, we need it for our tax base, we can't make it illegal. So talk a little bit about the legal status of this plant and this business in Indonesia.
That's a great question. I mean, I'll be the first to say that a lot of the legal system in Indonesia is very unclear. There's a lot of overlap of different laws. It can be just highly confusing, and it's actually kind of funny, going out to Borneo and spending time in Indonesia. People know, okay, this is legal for export, but there is a lot of, um, conflicting information and misinformation about whether it's, legal for local consumption. Um, I don't want to comment on it because it's actually I don't have a fully clear understanding of it. I think basically it's legal to consume, but there's some conflicting laws. I would have to check into it as of 2026, basically, to give you a concrete answer as to what is permissible locally. Yeah.
Well, one of the interesting things that I found is that there was a law passed in 2024 that basically said formalized the legality of exporting kratom from Indonesia, but that it had to be under a certain particle size. And I
Hmm.
actually know a buddy of mine who has a different kratom company, and their whole business model was tea leaves. Their business model was, tea bags, and they used to source from Indonesia. And then this Indonesian law that, on the one hand, made the whole business legal, but on the other hand, it totally decimated my buddy's business because they could no longer source the leaves from Indonesia. So now they're, I think, getting them from Thailand instead. Kratom used to be illegal in Thailand,
Hmm.
but they recently legalized it alongside cannabis. Um, so there's this really interesting like gray area that exists both in the country of origin, but then also down the supply chain for American companies who are trying to source it. Uh, but then speaking of things on the American side of things, there's a lot of states that are banning kratom. Like there's I think Kansas is trying to ban it right now. Tennessee is trying to ban it. Connecticut just did ban it. California is in this weird legal gray area. right now where it's getting removed from shelves, but it's not officially banned. Um, one, are you worried about the impact of these bills in the States for your business? And two, do you feel like there's any awareness of the among kratom farmers or the kratom industry in Borneo about like the risks that prohibition might pose to them?
Absolutely, yeah. People in Indonesia are aware of the potential changing legal climate in the U.S. and are absolutely worried about it, and realize that there's now hundreds, um, tens of thousands, even hundreds of thousands of people that are working in the kratom industry in West Borneo, Kapuas Hulu especially. Yeah, potentially hundreds of thousands of people would lose their their main livelihood. People are absolutely worried about that. There's also just the concern that there's, I think, an estimated like 44 million kratom trees that have been planted across Borneo, and what could happen if there was a change legally in the U.S. Because, of course, I think as you've spoken about in your podcast before, a lot of smaller countries will look to the U.S. Not that Indonesia is a small country, but population wise, but we'll look to the U.S. for their drug policy. So if the U.S. were to ban kratom and that were to then happen in Indonesia, then there's this massive potential ecological issue that could happen with deforesting kratom trees. It's absolutely something that's on people's mind, and yeah, as you mentioned, it definitely is a concerning time legislatively with kratom. We're seeing all kinds of different bans being proposed, different counties, municipalities, states. It's a constant legal battle, and luckily, here in Oregon, we're a rather prohibitionist state in the Pacific Northwest, and we also have a really good Kratom Consumer Protection Act implemented. But that's certainly not the case, everywhere around the U.S. And we're always encouraging, our customers and friends and people we know to try and get involved and to fight these bans, and hopefully we can beat it back like we did back in 2016.
I think that's very, very important. I've been very impressed with how organized and how mobilized the kratom consumer community is in America. And it's also sometimes just not enough, unfortunately. And like you said, you do see a lot of other countries take their cues from the US. Drug policy and drug control is one of the main ways that America enforces its hegemon status. It's all you have to do is look at what Trump was doing to Venezuela under the pretense of drug control and drug smuggling to be like, whoa, you do not want to end up on America's bad side. So anyway, on a lighter note, had a couple more questions, and then I can let you go. Um,
Yeah, please.
just because I know I'm sure there's those people who maybe use kratom but don't know a lot about it who listen to this podcast. Strains, it's mostly bullshit, right? The idea that it's all one plant. There's not a it's not like cannabis where there's different cultivars and different
Yes,
stuff.
absolutely. Strains are total bullshit. People have demonstrated this for years, and yet you still see tons and tons of companies selling all of these strains that absolutely 100% do not exist. You have just the one type of kratom tree fundamentally. We actually have like a bit of a funny anecdote of this that happened to us from the first time we went out to Borneo. We had um, especially back in 2019, there was less reporting on it, less people had investigated it, but we were pretty certain, okay, this whole strain thing is not real. And we went out to one of the first kratom farms we went to visit, and we're talking to these old kratom growers, and we're saying, okay, so like, let's go through the field you have here. Like, what are the different strains you're growing? Tell us about what you have on your land. And these old timey kratom growers, just kind of like laughing at us and being kind of confused and just being like, yes, that's a kratom tree, and okay, yeah, that's a bigger one, and that's my neighbor's, and there's absolutely no delineation of different strains. So this is by and large just this marketing fabrication. Obviously, you can get differences in the drying of the plants, so you can kind of create this red, white, green distinction through how the leaves are dried and cured. But that's going to be really similar to tea, where you have the one tea plant, and you can make matcha, you can make black tea, oolong, pu'er, etc., etc., through the different drying and curing processes. So it's the same thing with kratom. Kratom strains do not exist. You have the one type of kratom tree, and that you can then dry it and cure it in different ways. Yeah.
Yeah. Very, very cool. I was gonna ask about colors anyway, but it sounds like you answered my next question. And then I guess the thing I'd want to end on is obviously kratom gets a bad rap here in among a lot of people who don't know a lot about it. Obviously, there's a risk of addiction as there is with a lot of good things, and it's certainly not for everyone. But if you had a message to share to people who maybe don't know a lot about it, maybe they're a little wary about it, maybe they know someone who's experienced addiction or whatever. If you have a message to the person who was nervous about it, what would you say?
Yeah, well, I would say that kratom is an absolutely amazing plant with a ton of wonderful applications, and it absolutely can be used responsibly. It can also be abused like anything else, but kratom can absolutely be used on an occasional or even regular basis in a total responsible manner as long as, dosage is taken into consideration, et cetera, et cetera, and it's used in a wise and responsible way. And it's beautiful to go out to Malaysia. We've spent a lot of time in Malaysia and Thailand and Indonesia, of course, spending time with communities that have been cultivating and consuming kratom for generations, for centuries. I met a gentleman in Thailand that was 91 years old and had been consuming kratom daily since he was 16. And we got to go out and see the kratom tree in his backyard that he'd been harvesting for 60 years. I think he'd been consuming kratom since like the mid 1940s. It was an absolute incredible story. And we see that in these cultures, kratom is not regarded really as a drug. It's regarded like you would a coffee to get your work done for working and productivity, or people regard it as you would like a beer to relax and socialize with the community in the evenings. Um, so in these communities that have been using the plant for a really long time, they don't view it as something sketchy or as some sort of drug. It's really part of the culture, and yeah, it's amazing for working and productivity, whether you're writing a paper or working in a rice field or building a house or whatnot. It has a really lovely elevating effect energetically, and then is also a really lovely alternative to alcohol because we see that yeah, a lot of the communities that Kratom grows in are not ones that consume alcohol due to religious reasons. So Kratom is consumed there just to unwind and spend time with friends.
Yeah, I remember learning a little bit. I did this episode about Thailand. One of the first episodes of Drug Cultures I did was about kratom in Thailand, and
It's a good
specifically
one. Yeah.
oh, you listened. I'm honored.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. I listened to it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we've spent a lot of time in southern Thailand, quite recently, in fact, because there's obviously been the recent legalization of Kratom in Thailand, and so we went to go investigate everything that was happening there just a couple of years ago. And yeah, the south of Thailand, absolutely incredible. We managed to find some huge old trees that had just escaped the prohibition era, and there's very strong Kratom culture there. It's fascinating, yeah, and loved your reporting on that. It was really good.
Thank you. And what I was going to say is that the in that prohibition era, you did see a lot of it was targeting of Muslim communities because in these sort of ethnically Malay, predominantly Muslim communities, there's the social taboo on alcohol, and so
Hmm.
kratom is used instead, not seen by these communities as intoxicating, and and then you had the primarily Buddhist, but really it was sort of like a fascistic strain of Buddhist nationalism used this drug prohibition to clear cut kratom forests in this predominantly Muslim area. And it was really interesting to learn about this history. And I'm so glad to hear that some of these old trees have survived that era, and that Thailand is finally moving out of its prohibition era. I think that's so cool to hear.
Yeah, it's really, really, really interesting in Thailand. There's a super old history with the plant there, where if you had people coming to your house, people would it was the drink of choice to welcome guests, and can really be found still growing old trees that escaped the prohibitionist era a lot in the countryside in the south. And then as you go up north, um, obviously the Kratom climate is best to grow in the south, but you can still grow up around Bangkok, around the suburbs of Bangkok. There's a lot of new commercial kratom cultivation we met out there. Um, and yeah, you can see it, just completely springing up across the country again, and people are no longer worried about talking about it and are happy to share that, part of their culture. And yeah, it's just super beautiful to see that, just this whole renaissance of kratom culture happening in Thailand, obviously Indonesia, and then we hope to see that happen soon in Malaysia as well, because then after our time in Thailand, we crossed over the border into Malaysia and continued the research trip there, and that was a whole different story, where there's really old kratom culture in Malaysia, and there's still a lot of kratom trees growing in Malaysia, but um, the climate around it is a lot more hush hush, and people are a lot more nervous, and it took a lot longer to make the right contacts to be able to go and find those old kratom trees in Malaysia, and to even be able to get to the areas where people were willing to talk about it.
Well, that should be really interesting to see how that changes as well. Oshin, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much. It was an absolute pleasure to talk with you. Keep up the good work with everything, and to all your guests, whoever's in in Portland passing through this summer, come through and pay us a visit. And we'd love to, even if you are not a kratom consumer yourself. We really have the shop open as a space of education. So if you want to come see kratom trees, learn more about everything, come in and say hello.
Well, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Oshin Diaz from Jaya Kratom. Hope you learned something. If you liked what you heard, give the show a follow on Twitter at Drug Cultures Pod, on Instagram, that's consciousness_cultures, or, just give the show a 5-star rating wherever you listen to it. I don't know if that does anything, but I sure hope so.